Hello friends, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Bintou, and for today's video I'm going to do part 1 of my November wrap-up, and it's going to be my non-fiction November wrap-up. So I'm going to talk about all of the non-fiction books that I read this month. And there's only 4 of them, but they were all pretty awesome books. So I'm excited to talk to you guys about them. So the first of the books is Breath by James Nestor, The New Signs of a Lost Art. And I believe I gave this 4 stars. This was a really enjoyable book to read. And as the title suggests, this book is all about breathing. And over the course of the book, it's following an experiment that the author does with another scientist friend, where they basically spend, I think it was like 10 days, with their noses completely plugged up. And so they were forced to breathe through their mouths for that entire length of time. And he describes in pretty great detail the absolute misery that was that experience. And they were measuring like their health stats along the way, things like blood pressure, snoring, sleep apnea. And they noticed that when they switched to mouth breathing only, all of those things either became present or got so much worse. And at the end of those 10 days, they got to unplug their noses and breathe through their noses again. And they saw that a lot of the damage that they had done to their bodies as the result of mouth breathing was reversed when they got to go back to their nose breathing. So their blood pressures began to normalize, the sleep apnea disappeared. So that was really interesting. Not an experiment that I think that I or any normal person would want to actually go through. But I'm glad they did it for us so that we could see how it turned out. And then the other main part of this book is all of the different types of breathing that have been present in other cultures over time that have been lost to modern scientists, is kind of what he's trying to uncover and rediscover and tell you, the reader, about. And really fascinating, he also talks about cultures that don't suffer the breathing problems and then the like crooked teeth problems that we suffer now as a result of our smaller mouths, smaller faces in general. So I would say there's like 4 main claims of this book that I walked away from that I think were like the most important. The first thing that he touches on in the beginning of the book is the differences in the facial structures between our ancestors, early humans, versus humans of today. And this includes things like recessed chins and smaller sinuses in general. And how in early humans, these respiratory illnesses that we see today weren't present. And so he thinks that a lot of these issues come from the changes in our facial structure that have led to smaller sinuses and therefore not as efficient airflow. The second big point is mouth breathing is extremely bad for you. That was pretty well discussed in the experiment. I wouldn't say proven because it was just like a very simple anecdotal experiment, but he does talk about cultures who train from birth their babies to not breathe through their mouths, but to breathe only through their noses because they know that mouth breathing is bad for them. Third thing that I found really fascinating was that carbon dioxide can be good for you. So there's like a breathing technique in this book where you exhale for longer than you inhaled for, so you're increasing your CO2 levels in your blood. And there's a specific kind of CO2 training that occurs in here. I forget all of the details, but it was really fascinating. And then the last thing was the most efficient breathing rhythm, which he describes as 5.5 second inhales, 5.5 second exhales, for a total of 5.5 breaths in a minute. So I went ahead and set my Apple Watch to do 5 breaths per minute. Now, I also did listen to the audiobook while I was reading this book. I got the audiobook from my public library. And I will say that, one, the audiobook deviates from the physical book quite a lot. And I'm not exactly sure why that's the case, but there's like parts of the physical book that are completely left out of the audiobook. And maybe it's an abridged version or they've edited it since the first release. I don't know. But that's definitely something to watch out for. Now, the one thing I will say about the audiobook, and this is an awesome strength, is that at the end of the audiobook, when the book is all done, in the physical book, he lists out how to carry out all of the different breathing exercises that each chapter focused on. In the audiobook, you're actually guided through those breathing practices, and I actually sat down and did them, and it was really cool. But definitely a lot of fun to try out. So if you are considering reading this book, I would highly recommend also getting the audiobook and doing those exercises, because it's much easier to be guided through them than to read about them and try to implement them yourself. At the end of the day, there are a lot of very interesting claims that are made in this book, and you kind of have to decide for yourself whether or not you think that they are well supported. I knocked off a star because I feel like a lot of them were very anecdotal, so I don't think they were all very well supported. But at the very least, nothing in here is very particularly harmful, and it was indeed very fascinating. So 4 out of 5 stars to Breath by James Nestor. The next nonfiction book I read is Hood Feminism by Mikki Kendall. And so this is a book that was on my TBR from, I don't even know when, I think it was like several months ago, but I finally got around to reading this book. And I'm really glad that I did. So I could summarize this book entirely by saying that the argument that the author is making in this book is simply that the version of feminism that is popular today that most people practice is actually solely kind of working for the advancement of white middle class women, and it's leaving out a lot of the issues that affect lower income women or women of color. And so feminism should, as a result, concern itself a lot more with the issues that may not initially be considered feminist, but do affect women, and particularly poor women and women of color. A lot of the book centers on, so she talks about her own lived experiences as someone who was low income for a portion of her life and a woman of color as well. And each chapter is basically concerned with a different issue. And she touches on things like gun violence and how that has a pretty significant effect on women. Other topics are like food insecurity, housing insecurity, quality of education that is available to young girls in schools. It was fascinating because these are issues that we are generally aware of exist. Like, I know that these are issues that exist, but I did not previously consider them feminist issues. And in that regard, I feel like she has changed my thinking on that matter. With that said, this is a informative book. So I feel like after reading this book, it changed what I consider feminist. This isn't a book that's going to provide you with like actionable steps on how to actually do anything about it. But of course, that's not really the purpose. You probably don't even need to read this entire book to take that message away. But I think the stories that she adds in this book are very valuable. And we all know personal stories do have pretty significant impact on people, more so than just statistics. This is definitely a book that I think many people could stand to read. And I gave this one 4.5 out of 5 stars. It was pretty awesome. The next book that I read was The Story of More: How We Got to Climate Change and Where to Go From Here by Jahren. I really enjoyed this book. I think it was very well written, and that probably has to do with the fact that the author, she is a professor, so she is an educator, and she wrote the book in a very accessible manner. So the actual reading of the book was very enjoyable, and it was very quick and easy to get through despite the serious topic of conversation that it deals with. Now, the main idea of this book is use less and share more. So she talks about how as members of, and I live in the United States, so as members of these countries, US, Canada, and all the other major first world countries in the world, we use a disproportionate amount of the world's energy, and yet we don't have the population to really justify that usage. And of course, the United States is at the top of that list. So the United States, with a very small percentage of the world's population, uses more energy than any other country in the world. And so she points out things that we kind of already know, like we produce enough food as a world to feed every human, every living human in the world, and yet there are 1 billion people that go hungry. And a lot of it comes down to our inability to efficiently distribute the resources that we have. And then, of course, you get onto the fossil fuel usage, which is where a significant portion of this book is. I really appreciate her honesty because she does mention solutions, but she also mentions that at present moment, like it's not really possible to utilize those solutions. So it's not possible to convert all of our energy from, coal, natural gas into solar and wind energy. We're just not there yet in our infrastructure. But that's not to say that it shouldn't start, people shouldn't start taking those steps. And she also mentioned things that you could do. At the very end of the book, there's actually a series of exercises that you can kind of take on over the course of a week or so to really get an idea of the amount of energy that you use, and also how you as a single person could reduce your energy usage. I think the saddest thing about this book, and again, this is also something that I'm sure most of us are aware of, is that considering the fact that we do use, and when I say we, again, I'm talking about Americans, we do use a disproportionate amount of the world's energy, yet the effect of climate change is affecting those that don't happen to use that much energy. So for example, if you live in Bangladesh, you may be starting to feel the effects of climate change with rising sea levels, and yet you're suffering those consequences, but you were technically you didn't suffer any of the benefit that led to those consequences. This was a great book. I really enjoyed it. I learned, there's some things that I already knew. Actually, there was a lot of it that I already knew, but there are still things in this book that I hadn't ever considered or thought about, and it was absolutely worth the read. I would highly recommend it. The reason I picked this up is because I think it was on one of the Goodreads Choice Awards. It didn't make it to the final round, which is a shame because I really did like it. There is another climate change book that did, and maybe I will pick that one up in the future. But yes, I do recommend this one if you're looking for a nice, easy to read book that covers kind of all the facets of climate change. And then the last book is called Misbehaving by Richard Thaler. And this is a book on economics, but not like the economics that you would take in a regular college level econ class. Well, sort of, because it deals with the principles of, regular economic supply and demand. But what makes this book really interesting is that he focuses on behavioral economics. So economics within the context of human behavior, because as we know, human behavior isn't always logical, whereas economics in theory is very, very logical, but it doesn't describe how we behave as people. Economics is one of those topics that has always fascinated me. I took an econ class just for fun when I was in college. I didn't go beyond that because I wasn't an econ major, but the things that I learned in that class, I still refer back on. There are principles in economics that really do influence your day-to-day lives, and it's really amazing that it isn't more of a required course. Things like supply, demand, opportunity costs, those are really important topics. The reason that I picked up this book is personal finance in general as a topic is one of those things that really fascinates me. Like if you look at my YouTube feed, I've watched various different niches on YouTube. There's a lot of booktube videos, and then you'll find some fitness videos, some makeup videos, and then some personal finance videos. A lot of them, because it's there's this, I guess, very logical set of rules that make sense, and yet our behavior is always very different from what would be the logical thing to do, despite us knowing that it is the logical thing to do. And that's kind of the discussion in this entire book is, here is how an econ would behave, like a very rational, logical person would behave this way, and yet here is how humans actually behave, and it's very different from what you would expect from an econ. Overall, this is a rather long book, and I would say that it can get heavy in the theory/detail at times. I will say this, I have only ever taken one economics course as an undergrad, I don't even know, nearly 8 years ago, maybe at this point, maybe a little bit more. And I had no trouble understanding that material. So it's not a huge deal, but know that maybe there'll be some things in it that go over your head if you don't really know anything about economics. All right, actually jumping in because I just finished the audiobook for a 5th nonfiction book for November, and that is No Filter. And I'll include a little picture of that here. And I did listen to this entirely on audiobook, got it from my library. This is another book that I picked up because it was on Goodreads. It was one of the, I don't remember if it made it to the final list, but it was one of the Goodreads final lists for, or it was in one of the rounds for the Goodreads Choice Awards for 2020. And this book is all about Instagram. And it was really fascinating. So it takes a look at pretty much the story of Instagram from the start to about present day. So the author is sort of discussing how Instagram got its start and the idea behind the company. And a lot of this I was not aware of. I don't consider myself a massive Instagram buff, but I do have an Instagram, not that I use it very well or very often, but particularly as a teacher of teenagers, I have seen a lot of the issues they talk about in this book manifest, where people are pretty much doing things for the gram, and there's this strive for perfection amongst teenagers to impress their friends, and Instagram has in a way transformed their social relationships. And it talks about Instagram's record-breaking merger with Facebook, which was that $1 billion deal that at the time was totally totally unheard of, as well as Instagram's little fights with Twitter, because Twitter had also wanted to acquire Instagram, but at that point the founders, Cistern and I forget the other one, they just didn't buy into Twitter. I'm glad that I picked this up because Instagram, it really is one of the social media giants, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. And so to read about, or to listen in my case, to how it started all the way to how it came to be, and to learn more about the people behind it was really fascinating. I will say that this was a long audiobook. So I imagine it's a long physical book. Overall, I think that the writing was pretty well done. The topic is fascinating, so you kind of have to really screw it up for it to not be at least somewhat entertaining or enjoyable. But this book actually rounds out nonfiction November for me. Back to the original footage. All right, guys, those are the 4 nonfiction books that I read in November. This was actually a lot of fun. I don't think I've ever read 4 nonfiction books in a month. Well, I have if you count memoirs, which, yes, they are nonfiction. I know there was like one month where I read a ton of memoirs for some reason, but this was a nice variety in the nonfiction books that I read, and I really feel like I learned a lot about them, or a lot from them. With that said, thank you so much, as always, for watching, and I will see you in the next one.